All right, good morning and welcome back. Today we're going to finish up chapter 14. This is chapter 14, section 4, and we're going to talk about abolition and women's rights. So, abolitionists call for ending slavery. Let's get started. Abolition is the movement to end slavery, and it began in the late 1700s. And you're going to start seeing in the late 1700s where northern states are just going to outlaw slavery completely. And by 1800, every single one of the states north of the Mason-Dixon line had outlawed slavery. In 1804, most northern states outlawed slavery, and in 1807, Congress banned the importation of slaves. David Walker, who was a free African American in Boston, wrote a pamphlet entitled Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World in 1829, urging slaves to revolt. And then shortly after he published that, he mysteriously disappeared, was never seen again. In 1831, William Lloyd Garrison began to publish an abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator. Garrison is going to be the first major abolitionist, and he's going to really be kind of the person who is behind the scenes, who really pushes the abolitionist movement. Not saying he is necessarily the most important or becomes the most famous of them, but William Lloyd Garrison is always there. He's always pushing. He says, "I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." In fact, a mob of Bostonians came in and kidnapped him out of his, or took him out of his newspaper building, and were getting ready to string him up in the middle of Boston streets, and the sheriff came and saved him. Sarah and Angelina Grimke, these are the two sisters, Sarah and Angelina. They were abolitionists that grew up on a southern plantation and eventually moved north and joined the anti-slavery movement. And then when their father passed away and gave them their inheritance, instead of any land or money, they asked for slaves, and then they freed those slaves. So their two voices. Sarah is more, I believe it was Sarah was more outspoken than Angelina. It was Angelina who was more outspoken than Sarah. I said that incorrectly. Now this is Theodore Weld. He was Angelina Grimke's husband. He led a campaign to send anti-slavery petitions to Congress. So as a husband and wife duo, they really did a lot of work together on this and were very outspoken about it. Now, John Quincy Adams, he had been the president. He defended the slaves aboard the ship the Amistad and successfully argued their case in front of the Supreme Court in 1841, and in 1842 the Africans returned home. What had happened is basically one of the Africans who was being brought on the slave ship, he got loose. He freed all the rest of the slaves. They overtook the ship. They tried to get him to turn around, but they brought it into American waters. There was a huge court case on what to do with them. John Quincy Adams actually defended the slaves. Think about it, kind of like his father, who defended the redcoats at the Boston Massacre, and he got them freed and sent back to Africa. Now, eyewitnesses to slavery. Two moving abolitionist speakers, Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass will become the most important of the abolitionists. And Sojourner Truth spoke from their own experiences of slavery. They had been slaves. So when they were talking out against slavery, they held a different kind of voice because they were speaking from experience. And one of the arguments on why to keep Africans in slavery was that they were less intelligent, that they didn't have the amount of intelligence needed to take care of themselves, so the whites needed to take care of them. Completely ridiculous, because every single room that Frederick Douglass went into, he was the smartest person in the room. The very look and bearing of Douglass are an irresistible logic against the oppression of his race. And this was stated by a very well-known citizen at the time. In 1854, Douglass published an autobiography that vividly narrated his slave experiences. He had ran away. Well, he started speaking, and William Lloyd Garrison found him. He started speaking, and people were urging him to write his autobiography, tell his story, so he could get it out there. So he does, but now he's fearing retribution, and he's going to be recaptured, so he leaves, and he goes on a speaking tour of England and Ireland for about 2 years. He got so many friends there that were high up that had money that when he came back, they bought his freedom. He then becomes a freeman, and he starts his own newspaper, anti-slavery newspaper, and he actually helps people get away on the Underground Railroad. Sojourner Truth also began life enslaved. She fled her owners in 1827 and went to live with Quakers who set her free. In 1843, she changed her name from Isabella to Sojourner Truth to reflect her life's work. To sojourn is to stay temporary in a place and declare the truth to the people. And she was a very powerful speaker. She could not read, but she could recite the whole entire Bible by memory. Very intelligent, great speaker, very deep voice. The irony with Sojourner Truth is that she went to speak at the women's rights movement, and because she was African American, the white ladies wouldn't let her speak. Now, the Underground Railroad. Some abolitionists wanted to do more than campaign for laws ending slavery, so some helped the slaves escape to freedom along the Underground Railroad. You can see the routes. It was not underground. It was not a railroad. It was basically a bunch of houses or buildings and things where slaves could go and hide during the day and then walk during the night so they could make it to freedom, making it into the northern states and then eventually into Canada, because you weren't truly free until you were in Canada. Henry Box Brown was shipped in a box to Philadelphia to freedom. He eventually moved to Boston and worked on the Underground Railroad. He wasn't a very big man. On the Underground Railroad, people usually traveled by night and hid by day in places called stations, and it might be in somebody's barn, in the hayloft, or in a basement, or in a hidden room, and it was always a possibility that you might be captured, so it was a very dangerous thing. And actually, the Underground Railroad went right by here. Harriet Tubman. Those who led people to freedom were called conductors, and one of the most famous conductors was Harriet Tubman. Tubman was born into slavery in Maryland and once had her skull fractured by an overseer for trying to help another slave get out of trouble. She tried to get in the way. He hit her over the head with a maul and basically cracked her skull, and she actually had suffered or was suffering from fainting spells the rest of her life due to this. After escaping to freedom, she made 19 dangerous journeys back into the South to free slaves. She freed about 300 slaves on the Underground Railroad, eventually her parents. Her enemies offered $40,000 for her capture. That was a lot of money at the time. I mean, you're looking, hundreds of thousands of dollars today, maybe even $1 million. But she was never caught. I never run my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger, she said. Now, women reformers face barriers. Two well-known women reformers were Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. This is Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So these ladies, they start out by being abolitionists, and they're fighting to try to get slaves free. Well, then they realize through doing that they themselves don't have the rights that they should have. They attended the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London in 1840, but the men would not let them speak and made them sit silent behind a heavy curtain. William Lloyd Garrison joined them and refused to attend the conference. He was supposed to be one of the main speakers, yet he refused to attend the conference because they wouldn't let the ladies speak. In the 1800s, most laws treated women as children. They could not hold public office, vote, or sit on juries, and husbands controlled all of his wife's possessions. So as soon as they would get married, there was often what was called a dowry, and that would be like a payment given to the husband, and then he would become owner of that. When the convention ended, Mott and Stanton decided it was time to demand rights for women, and they decided to hold a convention for women's rights when they returned home. So it's at this slavery convention in London in 1840 that they come up with the idea of holding their own convention, and eventually really sets off the women's rights movement. The Seneca Falls Convention. Stanton and Mott held the Seneca Falls Convention in Seneca Falls, New York on July 19th and 20th of 1848. The convention attracted between 100 and 300 women and men, including Frederick Douglass. And I mean, that's a big one there because he is the biggest name in all of abolition. They made a document called the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions based on the Declaration of Independence, stating that men and women are created equal. So it's almost the same exact thing as the Declaration of Independence. The difference is that they put women in there instead of just men. Every resolution won unanimous approval except for suffrage, and suffrage is the right to vote. Many believe that would be laughed at if they tried to get the right to vote, but Stanton and Douglas fought for the resolution, and eventually it'll pass. Women were ridiculed for wanting to be treated as equals, even though obviously today we know that that's only right, that they are equal. Now, continued calls for women's rights. In the mid-1800s, 3 women lent powerful voices to the movement. Sojourner Truth, Maria Mitchell, and Susan B. Anthony. We talked about Sojourner Truth already. Scientist Maria Mitchell founded the Association for the Advancement of Women. Maria Mitchell became the first woman elected into the American Academy of the Arts and Sciences. The most important person for women's suffrage is Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony was a worker in the temperance and anti-slavery movements and built the women's movement into a national organization. So you have Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who are kind of like the founders. But it doesn't really take off and become a national organization until Susan B. Anthony gets involved. And she's so good at managing and keeping things together that she turned it into a national organization. Susan B. Anthony supported laws that gave married women rights to their own property and wages, and by 1865, 29 states had made laws. Women's suffrage would stay out of reach until the 1900s, and it wouldn't be until 1920 that all women were given the right to vote legally in every state. Now, that's the end of chapter 14. If you have any questions, get a hold of me. Make sure you get all of your work done and be ready for your test tomorrow. Have a great day.